It sounds like everybody's here. We've got people teamed in from San Francisco. I'll let the introduction happen in our agenda. So, friends from Callan are here. You guys take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time this morning. Jim and I, you know well. John Perrone, most of you know well. He's from Lexington, grew up here. So he's a native son. He's a member of our capital markets group. So this is a group at Callan that's largely in San Francisco, and they're responsible for our capital markets, doing our asset liability studies, also responsible for the projections that we do each year for asset classes. So he joined Callan in 2016, I believe, and he's a senior vice president and did his graduate work in London School of Economics, I believe, WashU undergrad, and also prior to coming to Callan, he worked at Barclays and BlackRock. So,
left Henry Clay High School out, man.
oh, there you go.
Duly noted.
The most important.
And so John participated the last time we did this asset liability study back in 2021, I believe it was the year. So that we wrapped it up. So just to kind of lay out the schedule, if you want to go to page 1 of the deck that you have. This kind of lays out the two-phase approach that we're doing with respect to the asset liability study. So today it's phase 1, asset mix alternatives. Our goal today is to give an overview of the asset liability process for those that didn't participate last time. Nothing has changed. We're going to go through what the elements of that study are, and then talk about, we've got some preliminary mixes, or as John calls them, straw man mixes, just to kind of give you a flavor on some of the output with respect to projected returns and volatility or risk. Also, we're going to go through the development of our capital market assumptions. How is that done? And then our hope is to have another meeting where this meeting we're trying to take a look at some other asset classes that are not within your menu right now. Look at, if we were to look at alternatives, just including what you have now, and then weed out some asset classes that you may not be familiar with, or not interested, or want to be included in the final list of alternative mixes that we come back with in the second meeting. Okay. Our goal is to have a recommendation and an analysis done for the August meeting. So our second meeting will be to kind of finalize the asset mix and select. And then we have an add-on, which is some approaches to doing the asset liability is also to go down into the underlying structure. We're going to, typically we segregate the two tasks, but given some of the, we think it's an opportunity to do the non-US structure. We've had some, performance issues, certainly. We've had Bailey Gifford came in recently. So we want to take a look at that non-US structure. Our hope is to do that, touch on that in our second meeting. So the phase 2 meeting of this, we would then complete that and then turn to the non-US structure, and then we may have some thoughts on whether we're going to stay the course, make changes, so that we're all in a position for a recommendation at the August meeting. Any questions at the outset or things of interest that we want to be sure to address as we're going through it? There's a lot of information. We're not here to give you a treatise on some of the alternative asset classes. If we need to go there, we certainly can address it here today at a high level. If we need to go down in more detail, we can bring in one of our experts. Okay? So with that, I think I covered the approach that we're thinking. Again, the goal is to determine a set of allocation mixes. I'm on page 2. The current allocation has a projected 10-year return of about 7.12%. Your actuarial return target is 7%. So again, is anything broken from a structural standpoint? No. the current mix that you have is projected to deliver a return in excess of your actuarial target, okay? We're gonna explore two asset allocation changes. One is what would happen if you de-risked to a certain point, so adding more fixed income, that risk reduction, and still maintain that 7% target. So again, we're talking about, you know, refining, I guess, the current asset mix and loading up a little bit on more on the fixed income. And then we're gonna take a look at some asset classes that we could introduce and what the impact would be on an overall asset liability structure. So, at the outset, we've identified 3: private credit, private equity, infrastructure. Let me open it up at this point. Are there strategies that you may have heard of in terms of conferences that you're interested in? You know, there's certainly a host of strategies out there, but we identified 3 of the more popular ones that we think we see in institutional defined benefit portfolios. So we wanted to include that and just give you a thumbnail and ask you if that would be of interest. I would say whatever we choose here, you know, there is no one perfect mix for all clients. So when we come up with our asset liability study, certainly we want to achieve a projection for that actuarial return. But we also want to be cognizant of the staffing needs, staffing requirements, the resources. So we work with some clients that have a full staff of 20 people working on this, right? So again, that constrains your list of alternatives in terms of what you can do or want to do. And so I open that as the outset. So with that, any asset classes that you've heard about, interested in, saw on TV, anything like that?
I've got nothing.
Okay. All right, so let's move on. John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, morning, everybody. Yeah, let's go ahead and jump to page 4. Again, what are we doing? We want to come up with a set of candidate asset allocation mixes that we're going to investigate, looking at their properties in conjunction with the liability, right? So today we're really focused on the asset side of things. Then when I visit you all in August, we're going to take those assets, and then you've got all the liability work that's done by CapMat. We're going to marry them together in a model and ultimately show a set of different projections in terms of what your funded ratio might look like with those different assets. So that's where we're going. Today we're drilling down on the asset side, and obviously it makes sense to start with what do y'all have right now, right? That's what we're looking at on page 4. And so let's just take a quick moment to kind of review the role of each of the asset classes in the portfolio. Right at the end of the day, you kind of have offense and defense, if you will, right? You've got your assets, they're trying to seek growth, right? If you think about what's your ultimate bogey, you're trying to hit that 7% actuarial target on a year-on-year basis. And so kind of the growth side of things, obviously you've got equities, right? You've got both U.S. equity and international equity, right? Over time, we expect that as a class to give you very strong growth, right? What's the trade-off, right? On a year-to-year basis, or even a month-to-month basis, as we've seen, you know, comparing March, April, right, for equities, May, right, that there's a lot of volatility there, right? So equities growth, also I'd say in terms of growth, you could think about, you see the red there, your real estate, right? Again, trying to deliver material return to the portfolio over time. And again, why is real estate important? Because it's delivering returns in a different way than the equities, right? There's going to be a diversification benefit for incorporating real estate there. And indeed, downstream, when we look at potential asset mixes, we may potentially investigate including other alternative assets into the portfolio. Again, we try to provide growth, but in a diversified fashion. Okay, you've got the real assets, a sliver there to provide some degree of inflation protection. And then you get the green guys are the fixed income. That again is kind of plays a defensive role in the portfolio. In particular, that core fixed income piece, the core fixed income, that represents investment grade fixed income, credit-worthy securities in conjunction with treasuries, mortgages. So whereas the high yield has it's kind of a tweener, if you will. It has kind of both a defensive role and tries to seek returns, right? But I guess from 30,000 feet, if I look at your portfolio right now, I guess I would suggest that, there's a lot of growth in there, but not much defense, right? You see, again, that core fixed income, which represents the defense in the portfolio, is about 16%. And so we did this asset liability study back for you guys about 4 years ago, and kind of if there's kind of good news in the capital markets in terms of John, what's different now versus when we did this study last time, it's that the returns you can get from core fixed income, again, that kind of key diversification component of your portfolio, far higher than what we were looking at 4 years ago. That 4 years ago, this core fixed income, again, you think of it as kind of being proxied by the Bloomberg aggregate, these investment grade bonds, that our forecasts were kind of south of 2% for that right now. Whereas obviously interest rates have materially increased over the past 4 years. And you look today, and core fixed income, we expect a return just south of 5% for that asset class, right? So, which is essentially consistent with what the yield on that Bloomberg aggregate index is right now. So we're looking at a situation where, hey, just out of the gate, right, if we're using conservative fixed income, we're already at 5, and we're trying to get up to 7, if you will. So what you're going to see in these mixes, and again, as John Jackson said, there's nothing broken, there's nothing wrong with what you all have now. It's just that you may have the latitude now to have a bit more conservative portfolio and still reach a 7% return target. So that's kind of the overriding kind of theme of what you're going to see over the next 7 pages. Let me pause there just to see if there's any questions. I know I threw a lot at you in short order.
Yeah, I maybe jumping the card here.
Okay.
John, one second. Crone, 1 second. We got a question.
Hey, so with that, and maybe you're getting ready to hit on this, but what percentage of that fixed income should we be looking at? I mean, we're already ahead. I get the position of trying to keep it conservative from a fixed income standpoint, but what percentage could we adjust to and still hope to hit over our mark of 7% return?
Okay. I'll show you some actual calculations we did a couple slides in, but kind of the short answer questions. We think that you could potentially add 5% more to fixed income, fund that from your public equities, and then you would have both a more diversified portfolio, more defensive portfolio, and still by Callan's estimation, have an expected return of 7% or more. So we're not talking about kind of a huge, let's put the brakes on and huge change to the portfolio on the margin. We think that about 5% more. And again, that's the core fixed income, which is the more defensive component. We're saying we should investigate increasing that.
Sure, thank you.
I mean, the 7% wasn't a goal. We weren't excited about going down to the 7. The 7 we went to because that was the reality of what we thought we were going to return. We were at 8, and then we went to 7.5, and then we went from 7.5 to 7. And so I don't think we were necessarily trying to adopt a more conservative posture. We just thought that was the direction that we were headed. And we were accepting that that was what we were going to see. And we were trying to recognize that by adopting that 7%, that would create a counterbalance in contributions from the city if the market returns weren't there. I don't think we were necessarily shooting for being more conservative. We would like to have, I think, a higher return from the market. We would like to have a goal of a higher return from the market. I don't know that we're necessarily trying to adopt a more conservative approach, unless I'm mistaken. What we're doing is or at least I was doing in my mind, was saying, yeah, realistically, 7 is probably what we're going to get. So I don't think we should be unrealistic and say we're going to get 7.5 and then come up short. I think we should adopt 7 if that's what the market's going to return. But I don't know that we should necessarily gear ourselves to be 7 if we're going to be higher, if we're going to return higher, if I'm understanding that correctly.
Okay. Yeah, I think if I try to restate what you said, that we don't necessarily want to create this problem.
Throttle down. I don't necessarily, you know.
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. I don't necessarily want to throttle down, you know.
Yeah.
Pull back.
Now that's it. Okay, so I think I'll be clear in a second why
Okay.
we're saying that it may be appropriate to increase the fixed income on the margin. Okay, so what you see on the page, right? What is Talon's current projection for your asset allocation based off our capital market assumptions? And you can see that we're forecasting essentially something on the order of 7.1%.
Okay.
Its current portfolio, I would argue, is already pretty aggressive, right? So again,
Okay.
there's about 16% defensive asset class, and you'll see in a second. I almost spoiled the punchline. I don't get you. Yeah, I get. It's a great question what you're asking. So you get that. Okay. Let's flick to the next slide real fast, which is our capital market assumptions for the next 10 years for the asset classes in the portfolio. And we've got some collateral in the back we could kind of dig into to the extent you all want to do kind of a deep dive on some of these asset classes. But the top order, I guess I would suggest at the end of the day, kind of focusing on what's the difference between the return on core fixed income, and again, you can see our expected return a little bit less than 5%, 4.75% for investment grade fixed income. And again, you can think of that as being very consistent with what the current yield to maturity on that index is out in the market. Okay. So roughly 5% for fixed income. And then when we look at, so at the end of the day, there's a lot of asset classes, but if you kind of simplify and distill things down, it's like, okay, we've got fixed income, we've got equities. How much do we want of each? Okay. And it's important to look at, well, how much extra return do I expect we're getting for equities versus fixed income? And that's gonna be part of kind of our thinking in terms of how much do we want to have relative to each other. Okay, and so again, fixed income, far higher expected return than when we did the asset liability study back a few years ago. And then when we look at equities, right, be it U.S. equity or international equity, obviously U.S. equity in particular, valuations, very high relative to historical averages for U.S. fixed income, or U.S. equity, excuse me. As you think about international equity, again, we've got some collateral in the back, valuations much more in line with kind of historical averages. So you can see that our expected returns for equity over the next 10 years, relatively modest, right, relative to history. You can see kind of low 7% expected returns, both from U.S. equity and international equity. And so and you can see the expected returns for the other asset classes in your portfolio shaded in blue there. Okay. And let me just briefly point your attention to under alternatives that again, when we were creating these straw man portfolios, we investigated what's the potential impact of adding private equity, private credit, private infrastructure. So you can see the expected returns for those asset classes there too. So private equity, higher expected return than public equity, but higher risk as well. Private equity, you're tying your money up for extended period of time, right? So there's liquidity issues around private equity, but in terms of, you asked Cal, what do we think the highest expected return asset classes over time? It would be private equity. Private credit, you can see private credit actually has pretty comparable expected returns to the equity complex, right? They're both in the low sevens, right? And part of that is driven by the fact that interest rates, again, are much higher than they were when we did this exercise, a few years ago. And then you see private infrastructure as well, But again, if you look at these, right, there's no kind of magic asset class in the sense that you can see that expected return and risk are linked, right? Those asset classes that have higher expected return have higher risks as well. So what we're really trying to do at the end of the day is try to create a diversified portfolio where, for the growth, for example, we have multiple engines, not just public equities are providing growth. And we've talked to some length about the defensive nature of core fixed income as well. So kind of putting these together, if we go to the next slide, page 6, and this is very closely linked to this discussion about 7%, just what we were talking about a second ago, in terms of why we think it may make sense to have more fixed income. What you see here on the slide, what we're looking at is, Cal's been forecasting expected returns for asset class going back to obviously kind of the last century, if you will. And so what you see in this chart is each year, what has Cal's forecast been for the premium for equity versus bonds? How much additional return do we expect for migrating from bonds into equities, excuse me. And what you can see is that the spread, the difference between our expected return for equities, and you can see here, we're using the S&P 500 in this chart, so again, kind of low sevens for equities in terms of expected return based off our current forecast. Bonds shade below 5%. We take that difference, that spread, we're only looking at about a 2.5% spread for equities versus fixed income. And I've kind of underscored it in the bullet there at the bottom of the slide. It means fixed income is a far more attractive asset class than we did this exercise last time, because now you're getting meaningful return. And at the end of the day, again, what asset class provides the most diversification? It's going to be fixed income at the end of the day, both in terms of behaving differently than your other asset classes and also diluting the risk of the portfolio. Okay, so let me pause there, because again, that's kind of a key kind of philosophical point in terms of why we think it may make sense to incrementally tweak the fixed income up of the portfolio. Okay. So now page 7, this addresses a Jones question about what does Callan think in terms of what could potentially be transitioned from equity to fixed income and still get 7%. So that's what this table on page 7 is about. So just to orient you, right, we've got the current allocation shaded toward the right side of the chart. And then the key thing that's in motion here is the allocation to core fixed income, again, that kind of core defensive asset. And so when you think about kind of risk and return of the portfolio, think of that allocation to core fixed income as kind of a dial, where if you increase the allocation to core fixed income, right, then we're moving on the chart from the target, right, to the left. So more fixed income, more conservative, lower risk. You see that depicted in terms of standard deviation of the portfolio, the variability of its outcomes, but also the expected return decreases as well. But again, what's different now versus previously is that it goes back to this idea of the spread that I showed you in the previous slide, that if you go into equity instead of fixed income, Cal thinks you're only getting an additional 2.5% a year on average, but you're also getting a lot more risk injected in the portfolio. So that's why, if you take 5% out of equity, for example, move it into core fixed income, that's what that plus 5% core fixed income is, that second column from the left in terms of the numbers. You can see Cal's still forecasting expected return is 7, but you see the standard deviation decreases as well. So if we're thinking about diversification, an important metric to think about in terms of diversification is called the Sharpe ratio. And again, I don't want to go too much into the weeds, but basically what it's saying is how much return do you expect to get per unit of risk? So you think of it as being kind of the kind of dividing those two numbers there. That and you can see that as you get more conservative, as you add more fixed income into the portfolio, you see how that Sharpe ratio increases, right? And that's just saying, hey, the portfolio is more diversified, right? So just for completeness, we show a mix too, where we're actually taking 5% out of core fixed income and putting that into public equities, right? And again, given the current market environment, given Callan's return expectations, we would suggest that's probably not the right direction to go in terms of increasing the risk of the portfolio. Because again, we're talking about increasing our equity exposure in a period where, you know, equities are highly valued vis-a-vis kind of historical averages. Their expected return forecasts for equities are relatively low relative to history. So you can kind of see the continuum there as well. And again, all these mixes, we're not talking about making huge changes here, right? Because I mean, at the end of the day, we're trying to make incremental tweaks to improve the portfolio's outcomes. Okay, so just to complete discussing the table here, so the primary thing that's changing here is the allocation of core fixed income. Remember, I called that the dial. That's one thing we also wanted to investigate was kind of the relative allocation to domestic equity versus international equity. Okay, so we also show a mix. This is immediately to the left of the target, where we're increasing fixed income. Here we're increasing fixed income by 4%, but instead of funding it from a combination of U.S. equity and international equity, we're funding it just from international equity. And you can see in terms of kind of risk and return characteristics, you know, very, very similar at the end of the day. And again, we incorporate this because we understand there is some desire to potentially investigate a mix that has a little bit less international exposure. But, you know, you can see, you know, pretty similar at the end of the day in terms of the expectations. So let me pause there because, again, kind of throwing a lot at you in short order. And maybe let me push on that thread. Is there potentially a desire to reduce the amount of international equity in the portfolio? That the way it's set right now, that target in terms of, you see you've got 40% U.S., 23% international. That reflects the weights of the global equity market. The global equity market is roughly 64% the U.S. and that remainder, the 36% is international. So that's how we've historically calibrated the allocations to you guys. But again, you know, to the extent you want to explore adjusting that, you know, we're certainly happy to do that. So let me pause there. Okay. And I know I kind of dug into that piece a little bit, but again, 30,000 feet, what is the key dynamic that we're exploring here on this table? It's really changing that fixed income allocation. Okay. And so to try to put a little bit of meat on expected return and risk, you know, these are can be pretty abstract concepts. What we've done on the next two slides is show a series of asset return projections using both kind of a 1-year horizon and a 10-year horizon. A 10-year horizon, you know, that's how we're going to ultimately model the asset liability study, because you think about it, in essence, you say, well, what is the time horizon of your pension fund? I mean, essentially, it's perpetual, right? Because the intent is for this plan to carry on in perpetuity. So we're in terms of being in a long horizon framework. Of course, the problem with long horizon framework is you have to live through the short term to get to the long term, right? So that's why it's important to also instead focus on both 10-year horizons and look at kind of what could happen over a given year. And that's what we see on page 8. What could happen over a single year horizon? Okay, and so what you see here, and just to orient you guys, we're starting. If you focus on the target, right, that's the second one from the right there. You can see, not surprisingly, the target, remember it had the expected return slightly higher than the 7% actuarial target. So it has a, a little bit, well, here it's rounding, it's a 50% chance of hitting that 7% target over time. And yeah, again, 30,000 feet, your portfolio has a lot of equity, right? Equity on a year-to-year basis can be extremely volatile, right? And it's not a good or bad thing. It's just when you're targeting higher expected return, that you have to take risk, right? So what you see here is any given year, you see I put a column in of what's the chance our portfolio has a positive return. That you can see that for the target, we're talking 2/3, 3/4 of the time, we expect this thing to have a positive return. But again, because risk happens, there's going to be those inevitable years, say like 2022, for example, where the portfolio doesn't just underperform its actuarial target, it's got a negative return, right? But again, and you can see as you add fixed income to the portfolio, right, you can see that that downside chance gets smaller, right? See how the downside, the bars in terms of what happens on the downside starts to shrink, right? That, for example, the target at a 95th percentile, so that's like a bad market outcome, an outcome we expect kind of 1 year out of 20. See how the target is negative 12% and change, whereas a portfolio that has 10% more fixed income, it's that downside is truncated a bit. Okay, so again, just trying to think about visualizing these things, right? And again, have something that adds 5% to fixed income or something that adds 4% fixed income, but it's funded from internationally. See how both those still kind of give you a 50% chance of hitting that return, 7% return target, which again makes sense because the expected return of both those portfolios is essentially 7%. Okay, so let's look at a 1 year horizon. So, high chance of negative return, or 25-30% chance of negative return over any given year. That percentage being lowered to the extent that you add fixed income to the portfolio. And then if we transition to page 9, this is looking at a 30-year horizon, or excuse me, a 10-year horizon, excuse me. And in terms of expectation, in terms of median, right, very similar situation, right, where you see the target 7.1 median. This slightly more conservative mix is still at 7%. 10% fixed income, you're actually a little bit south of the 7% return bogey. But the intuition here is that the years that have negative returns and the years that are strongly positive, we kind of move from a 1 year horizon to a decade-long horizon. Those things start to cancel each other out to some extent. So now you can see all these mixes have. See at that 95th percentile, we're saying that only 5% of the time would you expect your portfolio to have a return 1% a year over the next decade or worse, right? So you can see that things, as you migrate to a longer horizon framework, that some of that year-to-year volatility gets mitigated there. But and I guess the other thing to observe here is that, to my point, of these changes in the day are not huge changes that we're looking at in terms of these straw men. You can see how we're talking about incrementally truncate the downside potentially with a more conservative mix, but still trying to hit a 7% expected return. Let me pause there. So again, that's kind of one of the main themes we want to explore was the impact of changing the fixed income issue.
Hey, Perone, we've got another question coming in.
Okay.
Hey, listen, Trey here, and this is one person's view or questions right now, so not definitely don't have the pulse of the room, but as I've noticed, it seems, first of all, that it makes a lot of sense to do to pull the 4% from the non-U.S. equities and put them over to the add the 4%. Just off the cuff, that seems like the most logical ideology here. But the one next to it keeps referring to adding 5%. Where would that 5% come from? I mean, are we pulling that from a different asset class, or do we just need to come up with more money?
So to your point, at the end of the day, in terms of what their actual impact is very similar. That for that plus 5% for fixed income, what's happening is that instead of taking it all from the international equity, we're adding 5% fixed income, that 5% is going to come from equity, but it becomes in a more balanced sense that we're taking 3% away from U.S. and 2% away from international.
Okay.
And that's how it's funded.
So if you turn to page 7,
Yeah, 7's a good one.
um,
40 here, you're going
Yeah,
down to
roger.
37,
Roger that, roger.
23 to
Okay.
21,
Yeah.
5 total.
All right, clarifies it right up.
Oh, okay, yeah, pictures worth 1,000 words. Right?
They are, yeah,
Thanks, son.
It's like trying to drink from a fire hose here right now.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
He's clearly never done that.
Let me pass the
He's
torch
too
back
smart
to
to have to
the,
He's just-
to John and Jim, if they can kind of kick us off on the complementary asset class discussion.
yeah, let me just do a time check. We're at 9:40, and I guess it would be 10:40, right? Yeah, 10:40. And what would be, how much time are we looking to spend this morning? I don't want to divert from where,
Not a ton of
Focus should be-
time, honestly. Yeah.
not a ton. Okay.
People have things going on.
I
What do you
guess,
think? I'm looking at you, Commissioner.
I got all day.
She can't even run away.
I didn't schedule anything else today. I said, these people always run over 2 hours. Don't schedule me. For real.
She's talking the truth.
I did. I said, oh, this could be ugly.
Could we do 20 minutes for the different options, the different
Not
other
to mention
assets?
we have you gentlemen here, which is a rare occurrence.
sure. Okay, so let's work towards the 20-minute goal and do this. We've got 3 asset classes that we're looking at. One is private credit, the other is private equity, and then infrastructure. Private credit. Okay, so when this is a popular approach that really emerged out of the GFC, right? As there was regulations put into place because of the global financial crisis, that they wanted banks to get out of the business of some of these customized loans, so they constrained. So we have a industry that emerges or grows significantly, and when I think of private credit, I think of high yield from the standpoint that they're fixed income instruments. They are high yields, publicly traded. Private credit is not. So these are more customized instruments that are executed. What is the benefit? Why do it? You get a greater yield. You also, however, have less transparency, and it's not publicly traded. So John talked about that liquidity premium that we kind of roll into the risk of that. That's what you're taking on when you're talking about private credit. Okay, so with this customization, you also have the ability to install protections to a greater extent than you might be towards the more commercialized high yields. So again, the default ratios are a little bit higher for high yield than they are for private credit. So when John gave you the proposed or the projections for asset classes, you can see that high yield and private credit offers a higher rate of return, but also contains some level of risk. So you get almost equity-like returns with a correlation benefit of lower risk than equities. So from that standpoint, we have the map on page 12 that talks about the evolution, if you will. But again, I would say that we have done a lot of searches in this particular area because it is it's attractive, right? It's a diversifier. It benefits the portfolio. And as John talked about, that Sharpe ratio, which is your risk-return ratio, I define that as what is the ratio. It tells you how much bang for your buck. And the higher the ratio, the more attractive that is as an investment. And when you look at the mixes that we had laid out, the one where you add private credit, you have a very attractive Sharpe ratio that's associated with that. So let's talk about the complexity. So it's less liquid than high yield or core fixed income. It also is, depending on the vehicle that's chosen, and we would assume that you would be not choosing what we would call closed end, which requires more administrative burden, et cetera. Just acknowledging we would want to do something similar to a vehicle structure that you might see in real estate, in core fixed income. That would be the ideal vehicle for this particular strategy. So again, happy on page 14, you can see a comparison of high yield bonds and private loans, and we see that again for private loans, illiquid, but not as illiquid as private equity, right? So here you're talking about 3 to 5 years, whereas private equity you're looking at 10. Okay, so it's on the liquidity spectrum. It's not publicly traded, but again, it's not private equity. It's closer to publicly traded securities. Okay. Covenant protection those are the protections that I talked about, where it's customized. You tend to get those to a greater extent than you would get in publicly traded securities. There is some level of underlying credit risk because you're engaging in a transaction or loan to a counterparty, but the high yield, you also that similar counterparty risk. So that's private equity in a nutshell. If you want to have a richer understanding, we can provide a deck with that information, but we were just trying to capture the highlights and say, hey, look, John, we're good, have a little interest in modifying, or you know what, this seems kind of interesting, maybe we take a look at one of the mixes that contains an increase or an addition of private credit, and when you come back, maybe show us some modeling or more detail about private credit. So I'll stop talking there, as I've used about 6 minutes, and get your thoughts.
So you would be substituting one of those in lieu of converting more to fixed assets?
Yes.
So
Yes.
let's turn to 28, the straw man
Yeah.
portfolio, and we can talk about the funding sources for these alternative asset classes. I'm kind of taking John Perone's slide here, but you could see on 28, kind of just right of the target allocation, which you're currently at. If you were to incorporate 5% from private credit, the funding mechanism would be from U.S. equity and global ex-U.S. equity. So we talked about the risk return profile being pretty similar to equity, but there are some diversification benefits that you could see with a lower risk, which we're measuring as standard deviation, which is circled in that blue bar, and a little bit higher Sharpe ratio, which can be a little technical, but we led with private credit because we think this is the most diversifying asset class of the three that we brought forward. It's based off of the model and based off of the projections, but happy to kind of go into the other asset classes if others have, or maybe we could pause there, see if there's any questions on private credit first. And the infrastructure and private equity introductions, that would be a little bit different funding mechanism. So in infrastructure's case, you have a allocation to real assets. So that's through the PIMCO Diversified Real Assets Fund. So that's, again, publicly traded securities. So those typically commodities, REITs. That would be the infrastructure allocation would be funded from real assets. So that would be a substitution for PIMCO, diversified real assets. And then in the private equity funding sources, we would we would keep the real assets in place, PIMCO at 5%, and the funding sources would come from U.S. equity and global ex-U.S. equity, similar to what we did with private credit. John, did I have that right, Perone?
Yeah, and again, the 30,000 feet, that, you go back to the initial question, right, that the funding source for private credit would be public equity. Again, going back to what we're talking about, that incremental return we expect you'll receive for equity versus fixed income is relatively narrow. So why don't we consider diversifying the portfolio by taking a little bit out of public equity, but again, putting into something that we view as kind of comparable return potential and or diversification. That's kind of the logic there. And again, what's the hair on it? As John Jackson said, right? You are increasing the liquidity of the portfolio on the margin. Then what I would say, and I actually, you say that percentage of illiquid assets in the portfolio, right? Currently, you know, the private real estate, that's essentially illiquid in the portfolio. But then if you were to add another 5% across any of these asset classes, you're getting 14%, which in our experience is it tends to be quite manageable from a liquidity perspective. Then what I would say is, as part of the asset liability modeling, we're actually going to look at the specifics of your liability and make kind of a more formal recommendation about what level of liquidity is appropriate. I can just say from my experience of working with your plan, doing the past 2 AL studies, I'd be surprised if kind of moving from a 9% to 14%, the liquidity profile is kind of binding, if you will, or has kind of deleterious, bad consequences. So I'll pause it. Oh, actually, one last thing on the private credit. That again, we didn't want to overwhelm you with permutations there. That potential funding, sort of like what we show here on the page that we're just looking at, page 28, I believe it was. The funding source here, you can see, was kind of balanced in terms of as we go from target to private credit. Here is a straw man. We showed it coming from kind of 3% U.S. equity, 2% international. But alternatively, the funding source could be international equity as well, into what we showed upstream. So So there's a lot of kind of knobs to tweak on the margin. It's really more, is there kind of interest in private credit or getting additional education, kind of digging in a little deeper, I guess.
So overall, the recommendation, if I'm calling it that, is essentially to kind of follow along with the add 4% for the core fixed income, pulling from international equity, and then still somehow or another adding the 5% private credit. I mean, those two changes sliding together, like hand in hand. Is that the way it seems? Is that the way you guys are selling it here?
Separate questions. I guess I would say, first off, having a home country bias, you know, for the international U.S. equity mix, I guess I would see that as a threshold question to be handled separately.
Okay.
Do you want to have a home country bias, which means the global index is going to have a balance between U.S. and non-U.S. to what you have currently? Okay. And then, do you want to overweight U.S. versus non-U.S. by 4%? That's a question. And then, if that's a yes, then we turn to what asset classes do you want to add, and do you want to add private credit? In which case, the primary funding vehicle is going to be U.S. equity from the equity side, or non-U.S. equity from the equity side. So I would categorize it in two questions.
I'm following, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm looking at Commissioner Haynes.
Yeah, well, and I'm kind of anticipating round 2 where you tell us Bailey Gifford is still sucking mud and we should pull everything out of there.
Well, okay. So Bailey Gifford, whether it's Bailey Gifford or whether it's an international manager is not going to change the answer in terms of the overall allocation, right? That's more of
Yeah.
a manager issue. So,
Got it.
yeah, if it's not Bailey Gifford, it's some other manager, but the question is like one level up from that.
Yeah.
How much do you want US versus non-US?
Do you think that with all the changes in the presidential administration and all of the volatility that it's brought, he certainly seems to have a home country bias?
Certainly,
It seems like.
yeah.
Would it be wise to overweight or increase our own home country bias, expecting changes in that regard, or no?
No, I think that these are long-term strategic decisions, and pinning an allocation decision on the inclination of an individual would be perilous.
'Cause he's gonna be gone in
and-
3.5 years.
Yeah, and by the way, you don't know what it's gonna look like tomorrow.
That's what I'm saying, it
Yeah.
changes
So-
day to day, yeah.
So, you know, the argument in favor of staying with the neutral to the global index is that, hey, non-US equities have lagged for a long time, which means that they're relatively cheaper, whereas US equities are more richly valued, right? And if your view is that over the long term, cheaper is gonna outperform more expensive, right? So that would argue that, hey, the global index is kind of like the baseline. The counter argument is, hey, look, we're here in the U.S. It's not uncommon for foreign countries to have some level of home country bias. You traffic in that. Over the last 25 years, the U.S. has outperformed non-U.S. by a significant margin. That's historic. What's going to happen for the next 10 years is not clear, right? But over the last 10 years, last 25 years, U.S. has outperformed. But it's been over the very long term, we would expect, and even our projections for the next 10 years kind of show more of a parity between U.S. and non-U.S. John Perone, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. Yeah, it kind of I know we didn't kind of go under the hood in terms of what's inside our U.S. and international equity assumptions, but there's some modest kind of ding to the U.S. our U.S. expected return assumption, again, to reflect the fact that, you know, valuations are high right now for the U.S., right? That you can see that, for example, on page 34, right? That yeah, there's no one right valuation metric. What you see on page 34 is a host of different metrics, but what you can see is that, you know, again, relative to kind of long-term history, this is not like earth-shattering news to y'all, but yeah, I mean, the U.S. market is somewhat expensive, right? Given the fact that it's expensive, going forward, you know, we've kind of tamped down our expected return forecast for the U.S. to reflect that.
So,
Actually, if you guys on 34, maybe flick back to 33 too. I think that's kind of
32 and 33, I think. But go ahead, John.
Okay. Yeah, well, let's just do it linearly. So let's start at 32. So what you see on page 32, again, I mentioned that the global equity index is composed of, and this is at the end of March, composed of, say, 64% U.S. and the balance international. And the way your current policy is set up, remember, you have current policy is 40% at the top order. It's 40% U.S., 23% international, right? So you figure out what percent of that, of the top, that 63% equity is U.S. If you just do the division, right? You can see that right now you're kind of calibrated such that you're on that global world market cap, right? But part of that has been driven, the fact that you're at this market cap has been driven by the fact that the U.S. obviously has an increasing percentage of the portfolio. So if we go to 33, So this looks, all we're looking at here is what percent of the global equity market is US, right? You can see, roll the clock back a couple decades, it was kind of 50-50 in terms of US versus international. And then, not surprisingly, you've seen a steady increase in the proportion of global index that's in the US. Why is that? Because the US has had a phenomenal run, right? So that piece of the pie just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and which means that in a proportionate sense, it's going to increase, right? And so where I'm going with this is, we did the last asset liability study back in 2021, and it looks like the U.S. was about 60% of the portfolio, global portfolio then, right? And if we think about what was your strategic asset allocation policy then, again, the same policy as what today is what it was 3 years ago. Like you guys were at 64% 3 years ago, right? Whereas the U.S. was 60, right? So you had about a 4% home bias back then, right? And then the market has kind of pulled you from having a modest home bias to being kind of at neutrality versus the global market cap. So what I'm saying is that if you were to explore something like taking 4% out of the international equity, you're kind of getting back to where you were 4 years ago before the markets changed, right? So you've had a home bias historically. It got eroded because the markets have moved. But again, if you're comfortable with a home bias, that kind of this incremental change of, say, taking 4% out of international equity would kind of get you back to, again, an incremental home bias relative to the market. Let me pause there and make sure that made sense.
So threshold issue, can we do a quick survey and yes, we want to maintain or go to the home country bias that pre-existed, or market weight?
I'm comfortable moderately adjusting US and global together. I think that would probably be my preference. I appreciate the focus on private credit. That would also probably be my preference, as it balances the reduction of risk without sacrificing the expected rate of return. And looking at the three options presented to us, the private equity has, significantly higher risk for their return. And the private infrastructure, while I like the idea of investing in infrastructure a lot, has quite a bit lower expected return for the same amount of risk. So that would probably be my preference as well.
So if I got that right, home country bias, yes, and
Yes.
private credit, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I would feel comfortable with the, if we're going to move towards the private credit, then probably the scenario that you all have provided us, where we're dropping the US equity and the global equity a couple each, would be,
Okay, in lockstep, so that would be,
yeah,
Yeah.
what, 3 and 2 or
Market.
2 and
Okay,
3?
so that's maintaining the.
Maintaining the same ratios.
Yeah, it's-
I'm
okay,
okay with that.
so that's.
I
yeah,
don't have a
neutral.
strong preference either way.
Okay.
okay.
I would,
Are we on page 30, which kind of aggregates?
Well, that's what I was
I'm
getting
on
ready to say.
28.
I'm on
On
28.
30 talks exactly like what it sounds like you're talking about.
I'm on
Plus-
20, I'm on 28,
But go to 30.
go to 30. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So all 30's do is just kind of marry both those sections where we talked about moving
What's
the
it say?
fixed income knob and looking at the alternatives.
What's it
And it's a
Okay.
30. Again, I won't restate. I mean, yeah, we think private credit probably is the most impactful, most diversifying, does lower the expected return, right? So we kind of propose that as the one to kind of dig a little deeper.
Private credit.
And as was already, I don't want to restate things, but you
Yes.
can see the way we follow it right now.
Yeah,
it's-
okay.
It's taken
Yep.
proportionally from US and international equity, but that's we can be flexible on that for sure. There's desire to see what becomes from international equity. So.
Yeah. But I'm just one voice. I'm definitely
Yeah,
open to
and I'll-
conversation.
Jump the line and kind of echo the same thing. Despite living that fortune favors the brave, the institutional investing is probably not the chance to take. I think I said this a couple years ago. I mean, as you see those interest rates start to go up on everything, and what I think from an economic standpoint, it seems like the Feds are going to kind of keep it there, at least for a while longer, and rightfully so, most likely. Our fixed income, I still feel like is a solid investment. And I like hearing that. I like hearing the advocation on that from John Perrone's perspective. The private credit, those numbers look way better, I guess just off the cuff, you wouldn't think that looking at your expected return, you can kind of guess what that is, but I feel like there was probably more of a liability to that than I'm reading here. So, I mean, if your numbers are accurate, then I echo what Aaron said. I think that's a great opportunity, something we've not typically looked at. So, and I like the way we've got it with the threshold, which you've mentioned.
Okay.
So,
I have a quick question. Does our investment policy allow for private credit?
No, we would have to add that.
We'd have to modify
Yeah.
it.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
yeah, we'll become loan sharks. Is that what we are? It's a tale as old as time, John.
Because we'll have to update our investment policy then to
Shy-
allow to invest in that
Shylocks.
instrument.
What comes of that, Susan?
I think we have a committee for
Is it
that.
just with them?
We have a committee for that.
Is
Well,
this the committee?
I think it's this
This.
committee. So, yeah.
Does that mean that I'm gonna have to have another meeting?
Yes.
Yes.
Wow, terrific.
You
All
already
right.
have it scheduled.
Sometimes you gotta dig in. Tommy, what do you think? You like the way we're sounding? You heard home country bias and you were in immediately, I know. He had his American flag out right there.
It's done me good, but, I think I could be persuaded.
We're up for dissension in the ranks.
Yeah.
Nah,
No?
got too much.
Who else sits on the committee? And we have other members here, not just committee members, but you guys, I mean, what are your all's thoughts? We haven't
I like the private credit.
Ethan's gonna
Yeah.
talk.
I tend to be a little bit more aggressive, but like you said,
Right.
this may not be the place to be more aggressive. At the end of the day, we pay you to give us your opinion, and it seems like your opinion is pretty clear. So I'm of that opinion too. Brass tacks.
So again, we're funding the private credit from equity, right? So we're essentially taking a risky asset class, transitioning into something that, yeah, sure, it's got some risk on it, but it should diversify the portfolio
Yep.
and over time provide a healthy return.
Do you all have a preference or a recommendation between overweight to home country advantage versus?
Oh, on the home country bias, I would say we're agnostic because we have differing opinions throughout the firm, depending on who. I mean, there's nothing
Fair enough.
there's nothing that we put in front of you that we would be uncomfortable selecting. So we're kind of vetting the choices and saying, hey, reasonable minds can differ, right? So some people can say, hey, look, it's a fact that the valuation. U.S. equities are pricey and European and non-U.S. are cheaper. U.S. stocks have outperformed significantly over the last 10, 25 years, but that hasn't always been the case. And now it's a question of okay, the base case is to stay with the global index mix, and it's not uncommon for plan sponsors to take a home country bias, and now it's a question of how much. And 4% is not an amount that is anything that we would be uncomfortable with. In other words, just think it's not like, hey, we're going to have no U.S., non-U.S., and we're going to put it all in U.S. stocks. That's not the case. So again, and as you look at our projections, while for the next 10 years we see non-U.S. stocks as being modestly higher than U.S. stocks, it's not materially different, right? So we're kind of agnostic. Is that fair, John?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you pointed out the mixed characteristics on 30, right? I mean, you need, I mean, I had to pull this out in 3 decimal places to show a difference here, guys, so it's pretty, now, if you're saying, let's get rid of international equity altogether, we might go to the mat, but on the margin, it doesn't make much difference at all, I think.
So Tommy, you are with the plus 5% private credit on page 30. You're good with that?
Right now, I am, yeah, I wouldn't mind going a little more aggressive, but it's, right now, I'm a little uncomfortable about it,
Aggressive from an equity posture standpoint?
possibly.
Yeah, okay.
We are gonna have one more run at this to kind of like do the
What
mix
are we looking
segments.
at, how long, 3 months down the road, or?
We could, John, you're doing the work, but I guess in terms of the phase 2 subcommittee meeting, it's gotta be prior to August, but we can certainly do it in, end of June or July.
I mean, just kind of selfishly, ideally, I don't know if it's possible to have this meeting a month from today, because I mean, the real heavy lift for me is the actual taking the assets and marrying them with the liability. That's what takes a lot of time. It's pretty easy for me to tweak these mixes, so I don't know if like possible have a meeting this time next month or something, and maybe couple that with a little deeper dive on private credit to the extent you guys thinking about incorporating that, it probably would make sense too, as part of the agenda.
I will say we cannot have one on the June board meeting because we have a rehearing. And we don't know how long that rehearing is gonna last. So if it stays, it stays. If it doesn't, it may get rescheduled, but I'm not gonna know that for probably another week or 2.
Okay.
But the June board meeting does have a rehearing, and it involves attorneys and court reporters, so it could be a lengthy process.
Okay.
So if we could pick a day that's either later on in June maybe, or, I mean, cause July board meeting might be too far.
Yeah.
I mean, it'll be too close to, so I'm just saying June is a little sketchy right now
Okay.
for after the board meeting. So it'd have to be a separate date. In my
Wednesday,
opinion.
July 9th. It's a board meeting.
Yeah, but I think he wants to do it before July, so he wants
June
to,
11th is the next pension board meeting.
right, which will be a long meeting.
Yeah.
So we could do it the following week if anybody's available, or the following 2 weeks. The week of the 16th or the week of the 23rd in June.
Unless anybody's interested in maybe just getting lunch after the June board meeting and then coming back.
Yeah.
An afternoon appointment.
Tanya will be soloing it, cause I won't be here.
She's on vacation.
I'm on vacation, so. It's pleasure of the committee.
Yeah, and would look to you all on dates. I don't know if this is a preference to do it in person, virtual, I don't know what's easier. Obviously, we can set up a Zoom meeting just like this, and I
Yep.
don't know if it needs to be recorded. And
And we'll be
We'll be a little
we'll be
bit more
better on-
prepared.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, we could do that.
so yeah,
I can do that.
So we can do a Zoom meeting, or Teams meeting, whatever. But it's a matter of what is y'all's availability, Aaron?
I can do that.
We're talking the 11th.
Well, I think we're moving from the 11th,
Not the 11th.
not the 11th.
Okay, tell me a day then. She said, what day?
I mean, we can do any day the week of the 16th or the week of the 23rd. So do you want to pick a duty day or coming off of a duty day? Trey?
Yeah, I only work 2 days a week, so, yeah.
What would those 2 days
Not
be?
golf day?
To be fair, I mean, a duty day works like today, sort of works, the day after, so like the 17th would be great. But if we needed to do the 18th, I can make that work.
I'm bad for the 18th, but can do the 17th. Perone,
17th.
June
Yeah, that's
17th?
perfect.
that works for me.
Oh, the 17th, I got an appointment, I gotta go fishing.
I will not be here on the 17th.
What's your, how about the following week, Trey? What is your duty?
The following week,
Yeah, what's your duty day?
the following week I work on Wednesday that week.
So the 25th.
Yeah.
All right, so what does the 25th look like for everybody?
I can do the 25th.
Aaron?
Brown's good, I'm good. Jim?
I'm good.
I'm good.
All right.
I'm on this
I'll
last
just
time.
postpone a fishing trip.
All right, so the 25th, what time? I mean, he's in San Francisco, so I'll be a little,
Yeah.
I will be a
Oh,
little
yeah.
nicer for him.
Okay.
What's good for him?
Perone, what's good for you on the 25th, timing wise?
Yeah, I mean, if we do this time, that's fine too. I mean, I can get up early too, so whatever, if I want to be the
He's a
route
trooper.
jam. Yeah, anytime's fine.
We'd probably need an hour, right? I don't think we need 2 hours for the next discussion.
No.
So,
Agreed.
So,
Well,
uh,
I'm gonna back off that, because it's gonna be two topics, right? It's gonna be closure on this and structure.
okay.
So can we say 90 minutes?
we'll set aside 2 hours.
Just
Okay.
take 2 hours and
And if it's
Okay.
less,
Say
it's
90
less. If
minutes,
it's
okay.
not, we're cut off at 2 hours.
Okay,
I'm here till 7 a.m. So yeah, whatever.
You
you
can
guys-
Three
say
and a half.
5 minutes.
Uh,
if you want.
3.5
So
hours.
what time? Do you want 10 a.m. again? Or you want to,
That's a duty day for you,
It is, yeah. I mean, yeah.
so you wanna push it out to
Anytime
11
after
or something?
8 usually works
Oh,
out
wait,
on
so
duty
good.
days.
It's
I'm-
lunch.
11
That's a
a.m.
lot.
Eastern?
well, is Aaron paying for lunch if we come at 11?
Sure.
We're gonna eat on camera.
You heard her. Yeah,
Got
she
it.
said it, didn't she?
but
You heard it here
she
first.
gets to
Bring
choose.
Yeah.
Could be White Castle.
It will
Hey,
not-
that would be
It will
all
not be White Castle.
What about 10:30? What about meet in the middle and that way if it's done in an hour and a half, it'll be over
10:30?
by lunch.
10:30.
All right, 10:30.
10:30.
Does that work for you?
10:30, June 25th.
10:30 to noon
All right.
Eastern. I can set up the meeting again, get it on
Please.
everyone's calendar.
okay.
Might be able to do this right now. But,
Now, are we gonna be doing Zoom?
Yeah, well,
Teams,
we'll
is-
do-
if
we'll
that's
do
okay?
yeah, we'll
Yeah.
do teams. So we'll, the board committee people will meet in here and it'll be on TV.
Okay.
And we'll be better prepared.
25th, 10:30, okay.
I'll send you an email.
Yep.
He doesn't do the meeting invites.
You'll forward it along to
I'll send him a separate email.
Okay.
He's special.
You're the best.
Do we wanna discuss
Okay.
the second
12
agenda
minutes.
item real quick?
Okay,
Oh,
We're not doing.
no,
This is why I extend these meetings.
we're not finished.
Just when you thought
I've
you were
learned my
done.
lesson.
I ain't got enough, well, y'all gonna have to share.
Okay.
Hey, Perone, I think that concludes our materials,
Yeah.
so, thank you very much for your time this morning,
Thank you.
getting up early.
Thank you.
They all say thank you as
Yep.
well, so
Oh, he always sees it.
we'll be in touch.
thanks, Brown.
Sounds good. I will tell you, I'll talk next month, so see y'all then. Take care.
Thanks.
Guys, are you comfortable with where we came out?
Yeah, for sure.
You good? Okay.
That's exactly where I was at.
Well, then it has to be the right answer.
Sure. Me and Aaron both were marking the same thing, and I'm like, we're good. But then I was like, policy.
Yeah, like you know better.
All right, we're still alive with you too,
The
correct?
easy part.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, perfect. Rolling on, correct?
Rolling
All
on.
right, part 2 of this whole thing. Do we need to do anything else with you guys from Callan? Are you guys good?
I think we're good,
Awesome.
so we can get out of here.
Oh, you're fine. You're more than fine. Discuss fit for duty form used when filling out disability retirement. Somebody else get me back up to speed. I think I know what we're talking about here, but I know.
The main thing that me and Tanya want to make sure is that the board committee are on the same page as what we feel. We've had recently a lot of individuals that have marked that they're able to do or unable to do everything.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
So,
And that it almost makes me not take it serious whenever they do that.
right, so we wanted, like,
It's not
when it
accurate.
comes to us, we're telling them they need to resubmit this.
Yep.
Because if you're
You'd be
unable to do everything,
You'd be in a
then,
heart and lung
If you're
machine.
able to
Yeah.
do everything.
yeah, if you're able to do or unable to do everything. I mean, every box should not be
That's correct.
straight down.
Right.
Well, it was mentioned without invasion of privacy and HIPAA and things in a very recent report that we just read about somebody from the doctor was that all of them were checked unable, and even the doctor noted that that didn't seem accurate. It was just in one of our most recent, you know.
We also had one that was checked all able to perform the
Yes.
function.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Which means.
So we're getting both.
Right.
in a
For
sense.
disability, you can do everything.
Yeah.
right. Yep, I totally agree, yeah.
So,
You know, what's in question here? Is that you want to create a new form? Or?
no, we're not wanting to create a new form. We just want to have such as like the board's blessing or backup that when we get one that we're not going to accept it. And that it has to be, we give it back to them in a sense.
Who actually fills it out?
The physician fills it out.
Yes.
Are we sure? Because it seems like sometimes the employee,
So I
Fills it out.
suggested potentially adding a print line on, underneath the doctor's signature as well as
Yeah.
their contact information, was a suggestion that I had. Just so that if we have any questions, we know who filled it out.
Right.
Because sometimes they just
Oh, yeah.
scribble it, we don't know who it is.
Yep.
I mean, I will say, we had one that came in and he said, oh, I'll just change it here, give it to me. I'm like, no, that's not gonna work. So, I mean, that has happened before,
Yeah.
so we don't really know. So,
I mean, in my mind, if it has been touched then by the employee, then it's been tampered with, and then in that case, they're lying. It's,
right.
you know, what they're doing is illegal.
Right.
Secondly, then if it's not filled out accurately, it was kind of their job to explain that, and maybe it is, and maybe it's ours to. It very clearly says at the top what is supposed to be said. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Safe travels. Yeah, you're preaching to the choir with me. Be as strict on this as you can be. Like, yeah. This is ridiculous. And if that kicks their
I mean,
can
and
another
honestly,
month,
we don't know once we tell them that it needs to be completed again.
Mhm.
I mean, honestly, they could be walking out to their car and changing it and a week later submit it to us. We don't know. And I don't, I mean, that's just,
is it feasible to send it to their doctor? Like fax it to the, is that logistically feasible? I mean,
we've never done it before. B, I know that we've had individuals that have had trouble with their own doctor filling it out. And some doctors are not helpful? Is that a
Well,
nice word to
Some
say?
some of their doctors will not fill it out. They
Right.
tell them they're not gonna fill it out, so then they have to go to a different doctor
Yeah,
and have it filled out,
yeah,
which I also don't love, but,
yeah.
no,
But we
that's
can't
not fair
make
to them
his
either.
doctor do it either.
yeah.
and I guess that's
Um,
because they see that as giving some sort of medical opinion in the case.
Yeah,
They
some
don't
were
wanna
like,
do that.
I can't tell you whether you can go back to work or not.
So,
That's
let me ask
some
you
of their
this.
responses.
Would a very short and direct cover page be helpful? Like just kind of explaining what this role is, like what they're doing, that they're not a part of this, they're not gonna be part of the determination of their, necessarily of their disability or percentage of, but more so whether you've seen them, what they're capable of doing or not doing at that time. Does that make sense?
Would that be true? I mean, aren't they at some level a part of the determination?
Not in a percentage perspective. I mean, all they're saying is that in their belief,
I'm
they've
just-
reached maximum medical improvement to start
Right,
again.
and this is what they can't do.
So compare it to the grand
Right.
jury versus a pettit juror, right? Like, you're just determining there's enough evidence to support a case, to be heard, not whether somebody's guilty or innocent.
Right.
Right, but what they put here is still gonna matter. I'm just being devil's advocate, trying to
Yeah.
think for trial, which is,
Well-
that's kind of the world that I live in all the time.
Yeah, right, to
You
get
know,
them to
this
that
is gonna be
point.
submitted as evidence, and they're
Mhm.
gonna say, well, so-and-so, also a medical doctor, also said this, this, and this.
Yeah,
you
but
know.
we,
I think we
And I'll
need to
look-
take the date off for sure, cause that just messes people up. Because they don't understand why there's a date there. I think this
doesn't
used to
really
be a
make sense either.
city's form, I think.
No primary. Dispatch.
give me just a second.
Every time. Yeah, I don't see why the date is on there.
Uh,
Seems like one date at the
Well,
top would be fine.
At the top here, it says that if they expect the individual to be able to physically perform the duties again, what date?
Yeah.
But that's not really
But that's-
the purpose of this. Like, this is just the original doctor saying, hey, I saw him, or whatever, this is what I see on that date. They're not making a maximum medical improvement
Right.
recommendation.
I mean, I think they're
Right.
saying, well, he can't lift right now, but after he goes to PT 10 times, he could, but the rest of the stuff, he's at MMI. Like, I mean, I think there's some things that he could potentially get better at or not, or he or she.
But the date always confuses
Couldn't you
them.
explain that down here? That,
And some people don't put anything there, but some
well, I
people
know,
do.
yeah, I know, but I
some-
mean, you
some
know,
do.
instead of, you know, putting the date, you know, if they think that,
Listen, I'm not married to that date. We can take it right off.
Yeah.
I don't
yeah,
care
I mean,
either way.
I just see that probably the, issue. But, I mean, you gotta try to make it as simple as you can.
Yes. Well, some of them
It's not,
don't
it's not
even,
making,
they don't have the time. They claim they don't have the time to do it.
Yeah, I mean, there are issues with their treating physician completing this.
right.
Putting a signature line on there, and maybe,
Do you all wanna have contact information at the bottom? I mean, I don't know, like with their printed name, their phone number.
You mean
office,
the
doctor's
doctors?
information.
Yeah,
You wanna add
I
that?
wouldn't mind having that, because that way we can,
if,
Verify.
if we have a question, we can give us, you know, a contact where we don't have to try to look at this scribble and try to decide who it is and call him, and you have to call everybody to try to find out who it is, you know. Be a lot, I think it would be simple and it'd
So
help, wouldn't it?
adding printed name and contact information, is that what we're saying?
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And doing away with
But-
the date line, I
We can
think.
do away with the date, but our main concern is if we get somebody that has either is able to do everything or is unable to do everything, that
That's incorrect.
we can give it back to them and say, I'm sorry. There are honestly things on here that you can do
Yeah.
and sit at a desk.
Yeah, you're not an iron lung, you know.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
because we've gotten more and more that
Well, I
they're
think.
marking things and
Because they're not reading it and they're
Yes.
saying, I
Well,
can't do
right.
anything related.
Well, I
Some of
think-
the stuff related is talking to people. You can talk to me right now, so that's not true.
Yeah.
You drove here, you can operate a vehicle, that's not true.
Well,
Yeah.
I think what it is, you've got a rapport usually with their doctor, and he thinks he's helping you, and
Yeah,
puts it.
we've
Yeah.
discussed that.
You know, we've
We
discussed that a bunch of
So,
times.
again,
Oh,
would
yeah, I'm your
briefly,
doctor here.
You know, and he's helping you.
would
You know,
briefly
it's
on a
not-
cover letter saying, this is what you're actually signing, then it doesn't necessarily have to say you're not part of the thing, you're not part of their determination of disability, but maybe it's, you know, this is the first step in us submitting their information and them to independent evaluators.
I mean, any sort of explanation other than just
You're
this is
No,
probably
that's
going
them,
to
that's
be
my company.
oh, it's
valuable.
I mean, you know, some of those that do all of them, I've called them and said, hey.
Well, we
you-
don't
you
want
need
to.
You know, you need to go back to your doctor and get this changed.
Well, we are trying to push more things on the individual because we don't have time to go through like a lot of the doctors that
Right.
want it in chronological order, single page. We're pushing it on the individual that's applying. That if something's not right, they have to fix it.
That's
Absolutely.
which is where it should be.
And we're not
Yeah,
gonna call, we're not
Yeah.
gonna go through all your records and take out dupes
Right.
and all that other stuff, so we're,
The amount of time we do cleaning up.
I don't
It's
think we
awful.
should be doing that at all, frankly.
No,
I
Yeah,
don't
so
live
we
in your
have
world.
changed like the direction page multiple times and most recently chronological order, you know, one-sided, you know, they come
no
here.
dupes, no blank pages. Cause they just print them off and then they hand them to us.
They go to my chart and they print all my records. I mean, we
I don't
know
think
every
that's-
code they've had,
That shouldn't be
every,
your
it's ridiculous. Yeah,
responsibility at all.
it's ridiculous.
I don't think.
Yeah.
So are you guys okay with us just cracking down on them, just being more,
Yeah,
like, this is not
absolutely.
acceptable, come back,
Absolutely.
kind of thing?
Heck
This
yeah.
is your responsibility.
The harsher the better.
I think you should be nicer to them and go to the doctor's office more.
With them and explain the whole process.
And hold their hand while they're being
Well,
examined.
we have
and, you
spoken
know.
to a physician's assistant before to explain
Yes.
this form.
Yeah.
Which we don't mind doing that, but it's a matter of they need to take it back and get it completed properly. So we just wanna make sure everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, you just tell them, we're not gonna accept it that way.
Yeah.
And the board gave us direction to do that.
I know, but
Well, let's,
knowing our luck, they're gonna come find you,
Well, and then I'm
Trey,
gonna
and
tell
say,
No, send them.
oh, I hope so, yeah,
Bring
believe
it.
me.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah,
So-
they love to call me, you know this. Let's do that then, I mean, and
what
then-
we'll do is we'll update this, bring it to the next subcommittee meeting.
Yep.
Just so for your review,
Yeah,
and then we can submit it to the board.
Yeah.
For
I would
board
think
approval.
so. And then we'll give it some time, and next year when we're at a subcommittee meeting, like, hey, how's this been looking? Like, you know what I mean? Have we had that many problems? Because, I mean, we just take a look back. We're gonna know. We see them every month, or just about, you know, when people submit them, so.
It's getting bad, like with them adding body parts at doctors, I mean,
Yes.
that's happening more and more
Yes,
and
and I
more.
think we definitely need to reiterate that too.
I-
You can't go
Oh.
changing what you're doing, you know what I mean?
I mean, I just had a conversation with one.
Is the penalty of perjury, is this a thing? I'm using the right word too? You're part of
We
the lawyer.
tried to get him to charge him and he won't do it.
Yeah.
This is gonna be more of a civil,
Yeah.
probably.
I mean, I've had
While it-
doctors call me
At
that,
the end of the day, while
they're
it
wanting to
may
add body
fit,
parts.
You know, it's.
It's not gonna fly.
no, you're not adding a body part.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't, yeah, I totally
Yes.
agree.
Doesn't mean you can't.
I'm, you
Yes,
know,
it is, it could be perjury.
If they add a body part, they have to resubmit the whole application.
Absolutely.
is
Absolutely, the
where
entire
I-
thing.
yes, sir.
Start over from scratch,
Yes,
Mhm.
that's
what
Yeah,
we,
but the
that's
bad-
what
That's
we're
what
telling
we
them.
have been stating
But the
about.
problem
But
is,
that
if they go to the doctor, then we gotta pay doctors twice,
Yeah,
you know, which I'm,
well, but,
Not happy.
But
and
if-
my point
if
is,
we've
you've already
already-
seen that doctor, that's not an IME, then you need to go to a different doctor
They
too.
have to find their
They have to
own
start over.
doctor.
no, we gotta have our doctors,
Yeah, but
cause
we'll
we
have
gotta
to
be
start over with a new
independent,
doctor.
but,
Then we gotta pay for them.
I know, but it's, you know,
Well, and normally when we explain to them, okay, your other knee is not gonna give you a whole body impairment rating over 20% unless it's totally replaced. They're just trying to get as much as, and
oh, I,
They're trying to do the same thing as the.
you
Yes.
know,
Uh-huh.
I need that extra half percentage point so I can get my 60 instead of my 50.
yes,
So we're all in agreement with that, I feel like.
yes.
Nodding, you
Yeah.
agree with that, yeah. All right, perfect. Anything else? All right,
Motion
we're
to
done.
adjourn.
Do you need some?